Metaphors matter. They matter a lot. And if you look at one of the metaphors that's running around and influencing discussions of our education system these days, it's failure and things that are broken. In fact, there are all kinds of things that are broken. Our republic is broken. Republic is fractured. Our education system is broken. It's broken. It's broken. And our times are fractured. Now, if I look back at the history of things that broke, I think there's one episode that more than any other really illuminates what it is to deal with a broken system, what it means to think about it properly, and the consequences of having a wrong theory or conception of it. And that's the history of airplane safety. So I'm going to turn to that. Now, if you go off into an airplane these days, you may have the impression that the US created and led the civilian aircraft, but that's not true. Actually, it was the United Kingdom, Britain, after the Second World War, that was poised to lead the world in civilian aircraft. And I have the first civilian aircraft right in front of us right here. This is de Havilland's Comet. The plane in front of us, which will feature in just a second in another photo, is Yoke Peter. This is indeed Yoke Peter itself. And passenger flights began on the 2nd of May, 1952. These planes were quiet, they flew high, they were beautiful to look at, and for an entire year, British Overseas Aircraft Corporation had complete dominance of civilian aircraft. Nobody else had a jet in service, and they were flying to all the corners of the empire with this gorgeous jet. But a year after the service began, the problems began. There was a first plane that fell out of the sky taking off from Calcutta. That was blamed on pilot error and bad weather. And then there was another accident that was much more worrisome. A plane flying near Italy just fell out of the skies, middle of clear weather. It was seen flaming by several people off the coast and just hit the ocean. That was on January 10th, 1954, and that was Yoke Peter, the same exact aircraft I showed you in the first publicity photo. This was taken from an autopsy that was performed of the plane somewhat later. The approach to this was to deal with the problem basically with the British stiff upper lip. And so I think that one of the ideas may have been that there is no problem so severe that cannot be cured by an absolutely magnificent sentence. And I will read this to you. Although no definite reason for the accident has been established, modifications are being embodied to cover every possibility that imagination has suggested as a likely cause of the disaster. When these modifications are completed and have been satisfactorily flight tested, the board sees no reason why passenger services should not be resumed. That on the 4th of April, 1954. On the 8th of April, 1954, Yoke exploded in midair and crashed. At this point, it became clear that the magnificently crafted sentence would not be adequate to protect the planes in flight, and no expense was to be spared. An additional plane, Yoke Uncle, was placed into a testing tank, and it was subjected to pressure oscillations until the airplane fuselage cracked. And the basic source of the problem, at least, was finally made apparent. So the world at this point was informed of the basic problem that airplane safety faced, but it was fundamentally unclear how to solve it, which opened up possibility for new players to enter and deal with the whole matter going forward. Now, you may wonder, what were they thinking? How could the engineers have designed a plane which they put into service and when began just falling from the sky in this fashion? Didn't anybody know? And the answer is, we can know what they were thinking. And we can get them to tell us what they were thinking. In fact, we can get Jimmy Stewart to tell us what they were thinking. And I will have Jimmy Stewart tell you in just a second what they were thinking. And the reason for this is that in 1949, someone who had an aeronautical company of his own, an engineer named Neville Shute, who was transitioning to becoming a novelist, wrote a novel called No Highway. And in No Highway, he actually wrote, because he was an aeronautical engineer, so he wrote about what he knew, And he knew about airplanes and airplane safety, so he wrote a whole novel about a fictional airplane safety crisis where planes were falling out of the sky. And he put in all the theory that he understood about why this would happen. And then in 1951, notice, before the comets were launched, this was made into a movie. So let me play you the explanation of what the risks were to airplanes, courtesy of Jimmy Stewart.
This is the test
No, now Major Pearl. I must
Mr. Honey, this is Mr. Scott. He'll be in charge of metallurgy, so you'll be working under him.
How do you do? I don't allow
That's
anyone.
quite an arrangement you've got there, Mr. Honey. It's the tail group of the new Rutland reindeer, isn't it?
Yes.
What are you doing to it?
I'm vibrating it.
Yes, but I mean, what are you after? What do you expect to happen to it?
I expect the tail to fall off. Excuse me, please.
What's all this about expecting the tail of the new reindeer to fall off? They're already in service.
Old Honey has some wild hair in his ear that vibration might cause metal fatigue someday by breaking down the aluminium atom in light alloy structures. Couldn't vibrate anything little to find out. All boffins are a bit crackers, but I suppose he's the worst.
All boffins are a bit crackers, but I suppose he's the worst. It's a truly great line. A boffin is an engineer. The problem was now laid out. And I should say that it's really interesting to go and review what Neville Shute says about airplane safety. His technical description of what is going on is absolutely and completely and totally mad. It makes absolutely no sense. He's talking about transformations in the nucleus of an atom being responsible for airplane failure. And the reason he put this forward is he just didn't have any better explanation for what would put them at risk. I'll talk in a second about how the engineers were approaching the safety question. But the main thing for you to know is that because of the poor theories that were operating to make the plane safe, there was this opening that now became present for other countries to take over civilian aircraft. And I will tell you the story of how that developed. So we now move over to the United States to see what happened next. We begin by going to the laboratory of a physicist, George Irwin. He graduated from the University of Illinois in 1929 with a degree in nuclear physics, and of course could get no job, so was hired by the Naval Research Laboratories. He worked in various places. At one point he was at Lehigh, then he was at Maryland, which is where this photo was taken, and he came up with a theory for fracture that he developed in working with the ships from the Second World War that broke apart. He couldn't even get it published at first. Reviewers said this involved a theory whose dimensions have no place in mechanics. Here's an atomic scale view of what a fracture looks like. And his theory for it was viewed as utterly wild and really basically just totally useless at the time that he developed it. But there was a young mechanical engineer at Lehigh who actually was able to make use of it. And the way it happened was this. Really, one of the second-tier military contractors in the northwest of the United States decided after the comet went down that there might be an opening for another company to develop a civilian aircraft, and they resolved to do it. So they wanted someone to tell them how they should design a plane so it wouldn't fall out of the sky, because this was considered, bad form for the airplane. So they got this master's student from Lehigh, and they said, come tell us about fracture. So this is this fellow named Paul Paris. This is the best picture I could find of him young. There are lots of photos of him old. So he's terrified. He's going to go there to this company and tell them about fracture. He didn't know anything about it, and he was afraid they were going to find out. So he read every single paper he could find on the subject, and not a single one of them made any sense to him except these papers by this fellow named Irwin that he discovered. So he read those papers, and based on them, he devised a way for this little company to make their plane safe, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So what de Havillands had been doing was issuing a certificate with their planes saying they were free of flaws. They were crack-free airplanes. That's what they were delivering, and this is good because cracks are bad. They make the planes fall out of the sky, so you certify that they don't exist. Paris suggested a completely different way of thinking about the whole problem. In the new way of thinking about the problem, airplanes are full of flaws. You can't stop them. The flaws are always present. But what you can do is you can engineer around them. You can make the airplanes tolerate them. You can look for particular structural and metallic choices that make the plane able to survive them. And so he proposed that, and the little company they bet the company on this, basically. It's a little place you haven't heard of them probably, called Boeing, up in the Northwest. And after 2 or 3 years of work, they prepared a little video to explain what they've come up with.
This is the 707, Boeing's prototype jet airliner, capable of speeds and altitudes which will revolutionize commercial air travel. It is known that certain combinations of pressure, stress level, and detailed design could produce a catastrophic explosion of the fuselage. A catastrophic explosion such as this one during tests. These pictures show one of the double-blade guillotine tests which resulted in local failure only, assisting in demonstrating the effectiveness of the tear-resistant design. Cuts and drops conducted on the final test panel, followed by 25,000 pressure cycles, demonstrate that Boeing structural engineers have devised a design which is fail-safe, with no danger due to a crack developing in the pressurized airplane skin, guaranteeing that the 707 jet stratoliner will be safe in flight.
So that's how you take over world civil aviation. That's how it's done. And they did. So let's just review very briefly before we move on to the next case some of the things that theory did. And there's this tendency to think that theory doesn't matter. But sometimes I think theory is the only thing that matters, particularly the ones that we don't think of are theories, because that's just the way things are. You can't make a system safe unless you acknowledge the flaws and design around them. Systems that fail are brittle, flaw-sensitive, failure-prone. Systems that survive are tough, flaw-tolerant, fail-safe. The road to failure is paved with good intentions and mistaken theories. We now move to a different system, a bigger one, U.S. educational system. I'd like to talk to you about some of the theories that are operating there in order to help improve it. And the case I'm going to make is that we're right now theory-driven at a stage that's rather similar to the ones that the British were as they were beginning to watch the comets going down. We're in the grips of a series of theoretical assumptions. The evidence is beginning to accumulate overwhelmingly that the system is going down in the face of it, and we have to either come up with a new set of theories or watch the system crash. So let me see if I can back some of that up. Here are some of the dominant ideas which are being used right now as the theoretical base for the reform of the U.S. education system. Premise is that the U.S. is losing competitiveness because our schools are broken and students get flawed education, particularly from bad teachers. The goal is to raise the test scores and college-going rates of U.S. students so they're eligible for good jobs. Previous speaker talked about workforce readiness and its relationship to the full spectrum of needs in education. And then the specific actions that are driving a lot of policy are find and dismiss bad teachers, find and close bad teacher preparation programs, that would be us, find and close bad schools and prepare teachers through alternative pathways, open charter schools, and provide choice. It's a very powerful set of prescriptions, very active today. Now, my worry about this conventional wisdom is that it's as likely to backfire and produce negative results as to produce positive ones, because I don't believe it ever acknowledges the primary problems that the educational system faces. And I'll tell you right out what I think those are. Number one, concentrated poverty that infuses the school system. We see shadows of it at the university level, but in the elementary and secondary systems. I believe it is a primary determinant of many things that happen. And second of all, the enormous shortages of teachers, particularly in the STEM areas, that I think is a much more severe problem than the quality problems that are usually put at the forefront. Let me see if I can back some of these statements up. Just to begin, before I do that, I'm going to make a theoretical contention, which is the following. If you can find something which every time you change it, something happens in response, and where when it is changed, you can't find exceptions, then you've got to take it seriously. So if I go, I don't see a light switch here, but every time I flip a switch, the light goes on, and then I flip it, it goes off and on and off, and I can do that all the time. You've got to at some point at least consider that maybe the switch is causing the lights to go on. So I'm going to come to the case of poverty and start showing you some of the data I've uncovered. And I realize these questions of cause and effect are really, really complicated, but I will focus on the absence of exceptions to certain statements as the basis for saying that this cannot be ignored. So I want to begin by focusing on charter schools, and I want to do this not because I want to mount substantial opposition to them. I think there are some really very good ones, and I talk with people at them, and I've even, on some occasions, been a strong defender in public of certain charter schools. But I think that they present something very interesting to us. These are public schools that are not subject to the ordinary regulations and rules that come particularly from districts. They are very plausibly a source of examples for the success of the standard school reform package, because in many of these schools, over the course of many years, there's been the opportunity to implement them. So, if poor schools, poor teachers are the primary cause of student test results, not concentrated poverty itself, then charter schools should be able to demonstrate that. And so the first question I'm going to pose is, have they done so? And when we look at test score results, which are the primary means by which many reform efforts are being judged, what do they say? I've shown you 2 videos already about airplane safety, so I owe you at least one about schools, and so I'm going to give you one about charter schools. I think maybe the most effective, roughly 1.5-minute video that the charter schools have, illustrating the very, very powerful appeal, at least to the emotions.
I don't know what college I want to go to, but I know I want to be a teacher. I want to be a nurse. I want to be a doctor.
How come?
Because I would like to help somebody in need.
You wake up every morning and you know that kids are getting a really crappy education right now.
So you think that most of the kids here are getting a crappy education right now?
Oh, I don't think they are. I know they are.
Either the kids are getting stupider every year, or something is wrong in the education system.
I just try to do my best at school and make my grandmother proud.
Among 30 developed countries, we rank 25th in math and 21st in science. In almost every category, we've fallen behind, except one. Kids from the USA rank #1 in confidence.
Think about 60,000 people have gone to this school in 40 years. 40,000 didn't graduate. This is the damage that this school has done to this neighborhood.
A child that doesn't finish high school will earn less and be 8 times more likely to go to prison.
I want to go to school.
For these kids, their only chance at getting into a great school depends on whether their number is picked in a lottery.
So if Francisco doesn't get in, is there another chance?
No.
Your children and future generations are on the bridge of the Titanic, and everybody's going to drown.
Someone has taken an interest in you, someone loves you, and they recognize the importance of education. And the first student selected,
20. 9.
It takes a lot of outrage and a lot of good examples to say, yes, we can do this. When you see a great teacher, you are seeing a work of art.
I want my kids to have better than what I had.
18. 10. 12. 2.
and the last number.
Pretty effective, huh? It is. So This is the appeal of the charter school movement, and I think it's very difficult to look at that and not feel the emotional tugs and understand why it is that these are taking off so many places. So now let me start reviewing data from all over the country briefly that might give a sense of, first of all, what we're up against, help me explain my claim that it's poverty that is a primary factor we have to be watching for, and then look to see whether amongst all the charter schools it seems that they have provided the right theoretical base from which to cure this. So I'm going to be looking at high-end results, mainly math, from across the United States, a mixture of math and sometimes math and reading scores together. And I focus on the end because that's what we aim for. Fourth grade reading results are absolutely great as a marker along the way, but if by the end students haven't reached a certain level, then that was, like the first step in a 2-mile journey. So let's just look towards the end. SAT, ACT readiness measures from a variety of states. And I'm just giving you a subset of what I've collected. So here we go. On this chart, every bubble is a school. These are all the high schools in Texas. I show poverty concentration, which is percentage of students eligible for free and reduced lunch on the horizontal axis. And I show the percentage meeting an SAT, ACT criterion on the vertical axis. It's the fraction of students who got better than 1110 on the SAT for math and reading combined, or better than 24 on the ACT. It's really the threshold above which you won't have to get into remediation at a research university. You could also call it the I can go to college out of state if I want to college benchmark. Colors denote minority fractions, so you can see immediately the strong correlation between Hispanic and African American students and high concentrations of poverty. Now, I claim that there are really extreme statements that you can make about what you see in this chart. So if you look for schools where there's more than 80% poverty concentration, and more than 20% of the graduates are ready to go to college out of state if they want to, then apart from one tiny little dot, and in many years there are no tiny little dots, there are no examples. So I'm showing you 1 year. I could show you every year the data have been collected. That's the case. And if you now say, but what about the wealthy schools? Let me look at the same thing. Well, you can hardly find any schools in the state where the poverty concentration is less than 20% when fewer than 20% are meeting this benchmark. So the populations are completely distinct. And it's based on this absence of exceptions that I make the claim that you simply cannot ignore the role of poverty. You may wish it were present, you may have a lot of ideas for how to undo it, but I claim unless you take this into account from the beginning in any analysis, you will never understand what is going on. Now, what about the charter schools? Because I mentioned those, the laboratories where the defects of our existing system can be overcome. Here they are for Texas. There are about 180 on the horizontal axis, and then a scattered number above them, above that. The ones on the horizontal axis are by and large rescue recovery schools. Their explicit mission is to help kids who might not graduate at least get some sort of degree or certificate. So with that explicit mission, you shouldn't blame them for not getting students college ready by the SAT. There is a small number, and these are the ones that typically make the press, that are up with the better public schools. They do not break out of the pack. There are not examples of charter schools showing that there's a radically different outcome possible for schools with concentrated poverty. But hey, that's just Texas. In Texas, clearly, we don't know how to do it. Let's go to other states. Let's go to a serious state. Let's go to California. Let's see how they do. California also has one of these measures of students passing a threshold. Now it's for the 3 exams, math, reading, writing put together. They publish a threshold of 1,500. It doesn't look very different. There's one tiny little bubble far over and far up. I think that may be the Preuss School, which is the lab school at UCSD. But basically looks exactly like the Texas result, the same shape, the same change in color, association of high poverty concentration with high number of African American and Hispanic students. If we highlight the charter schools, it's a similar picture, except that there isn't this very large concentration on the horizontal axis. It looks as if there isn't the same rescue recovery sector, at least not to the same degree in California. You might be able to show using statistics that the charter schools are a little bit better on average, but the point I want to make is that they do not break out of the pack. They're not providing examples of a radical exception to the connection between poverty concentration and school performance. Let's try the East Coast. Maybe it's these western and southwestern states that are the huge problem. Here's Massachusetts. I get a slightly different measure here. It is average SAT rather than a threshold. Otherwise, so that you get this interesting sort of curvy little shape now. But other than that, everything is pretty much the same here. Again, strong association between poverty concentration and minority fraction. Again, very different behavior. As the poverty concentration goes up, the outcomes go down. There are no exceptions. And once again, if we focus on the charter schools, Massachusetts tends to do everything in education really well. So their charter schools are all towards the upper end. So I'll grant that. But again, not breaking out of the curve. And here are data for New York. These were difficult to obtain. I think they are right. Basically the same curve as Massachusetts. Again, this is average SAT scores as a function of poverty concentration. What shows up in New York very clearly are these very famous schools in New York City, Stuyvesant, Bronx Science. Those are those guys up there in the middle. And if we highlight their charter schools, this is all I can find, and the charter school movement is particularly vocal in New York, so I'm puzzled by this, but the only schools that I can get SAT results for is this very small number, and they're all way near the bottom. So that's what I find there. I said that things make more sense when you deal with poverty, so I want to go back to one of the charts that showed up in the Waiting for Superman video, which is to talk about the United States, lagging far behind other countries when it comes to educational performance. Now, this is actually true. I mean, you can just check it. You can check the US rankings in the PISA mathematics investigations, and indeed, we rank below a very large number of countries. Shanghai and Singapore are at the top. Some US states were singled out, and Massachusetts was the top one. Indeed, Massachusetts is better than Germany. You can all repeat that after me. Massachusetts is better than Germany. And then Connecticut is slightly worse than Vietnam. I don't know what you want to make of that. We haven't come to the US as a whole yet. So the US as a whole is right below Russia, but right ahead of Lithuania and Sweden. But Florida is yet lower than that. And actually, Florida is just above Israel. I'm not sure if, and then there's Greece just below that. And then we get down to Serbia, Turkey, and so on. I'm not sure if you would have all guessed what these rankings would be or where every country would be, but at any rate, that's where they all are. Now, I don't think you can easily make much sense of this. Why is any particular country where it is? It's very hard to say, and I think that if I just do the following thing, it helps you begin to make sense of it. So I show you exactly the same data, except now I start breaking them out and revealing child poverty after taxes and transfers within each country. And I think there's a little bit more sense-making that's possible. In the particular case of the US, I can break out the schools according to 5 groups. So what is the poverty concentration in those schools? The first 10% of schools in terms of low poverty concentration are up there at the upper right, ahead of Germany, a little bit behind Japan. The next quintile is down almost exactly on top of Germany. The US as a whole is the great big dot in the middle, but I don't think it's as useful to show the great big dot in the middle as it is then to just show the continued groups of schools broken out by poverty concentration, and you can see they more or less trace out an upper envelope with some exceptions of what all countries manage to attain. So the message from this is that it at least suggests that if you choose schools according to their poverty concentration, they're more or less, up with the maximum of what any other country will do at that level of poverty, and that's the way it is. And Japan is a little bit above the curve, which is great, and maybe we can learn things from Japan about how to deal with that. But poverty is a primary factor. We cannot ignore it. Let me deal with the other thing that I claim is a major cause of difficulties in the schools. I think the attention has been very largely on teacher quality. incessant attention to teacher quality, and I think really, although it's much more difficult to provide evidence for this, that shortages are the main problem. Now, here's a characteristic statement about quality from Eric Hanushek. If in fact we could just eliminate the bottom 6 to 10% of our teachers and replace them with an average teacher, we could bring the average US student up to the level of Finland, which is at the top of the world today. Finland had been at the top of the world when he said that, still doing pretty well. So I'll say one thing as prelude, and then I will tell you some reasons why I really just don't think that argument can stand. If you look at the best indicator that we have of US educational progress over the last 40 years, it's long-term NAEP, National Assessment of Educational Progress, also called the nation's report card. I can't break it out by income for you because they just didn't do it until recently, but you can break it out by race and ethnicity, and those were tabulated all along. So what this tells you is I have a NAEP score, which means it's a number which is better if you're going up. And that they are supposed to be, you're supposed to be able to compare the scales for different groups of people. So if you go to the late 70s and look at 9-year-olds, over that course of time, the Hispanic and African American students grew so much in their score that by the end of by around 2010, when I think it was the last results were available, they had reached where the 13-year-olds were when the assessment began. So huge progress there. And similarly, the 13-year-olds over the course of assessment grew to the point where they were finally where the 17-year-olds had begun. But now if you turn to the 17-year-olds, what you see is that there was growth until about 1990, and then it flatlines after that. So I think a big question that this raises is, why has high school stalled out? What is the thing about high school that makes it different from all the other parts of our education system, which, although it's scarcely recognized, have actually been improving steadily across the country, at least up till around 2012. And if I had more time, I might tell you why I think things have started to change and actually go backwards. But let's give the lower parts their credit for improvement. This study, I think, is illuminating. This is a comparison of entering freshmen in China and the United States at big state institutions. These are students who are about to pursue engineering, and they're about to take a big physics course. But it's before they've had any college-level instruction. And you can see a comparison of students in basic skills in mechanics and electricity and magnetism comparing US and Chinese students. These are very different distributions. The US students in mechanics are getting 50%. Chinese students are peaked at near perfect. In electricity and magnetism, the US students are basically just doing random. This is random guessing right here is the peak. And Chinese students are way above that. So now you could ask what explains it. And could be that the teachers are just terrible. I mean, this is because the US teachers are awful. But I don't think that's very logical, because you probe just the least little bit and you find out that the Chinese students are getting 4 years of physics or more, and the US students are getting at most 1. In fact, only 40% of US students right now get as much as 1 year of physics. And I'll comment that 2 years ago, Texas canceled the requirement that all high school students take physics, and since this happened, the number of students taking it and the number of classes being offered has begun to drop precipitously. Very rapid dephysicization of Texas is on its way. So I think just taking the class is probably the first thing you should wonder about before you start wondering about the fine details of how the teachers do, and you therefore at this point get this extremely strong difference. And if you wonder how we're doing about this, the main thing I need to tell you is that teacher production across the United States is plummeting downwards. So the biggest producing state is Texas, New York is next, California is next. These are Title II data from the federal government, and the numbers are just plummeting. I have some data broken out by secondary STEM, particularly for Texas. It's falling very rapidly. Has been falling for the last 4 or 5 years. So if in this environment the main focus of policy is finding bad teachers and getting rid of them, when our evidence says that our students are getting much less instruction than students in other countries, and students in increasing numbers, and graduates of our universities in increasing numbers are not choosing teaching, and we're not able to make this up with retired engineers and other solutions, then I think we're simply fixated on the wrong problem. I don't have quite the level or degree of evidence for this contention that I have for the role of poverty, but I will challenge all of you to find a case to make against me. I think this is a case of theory that has gone really rather seriously bad. Now, in the case of teacher preparation, I think we know what to do. We need to prepare teachers. This is our job. This is our UTeach network. This is our task. And so, of course, this map is way too small. We have way too few institutions on it so far working together to increase the number of teachers that we have. So I call for help from all of you to get the numbers up. Let me have some just concluding thoughts. The first of them is that nothing in education makes sense except in the light of poverty. Whenever anyone gives you any educational data to look at, ask what influence poverty has on that. If you don't do that, then that's like trying to figure out airplane safety without ever asking about the tendency of cracks to move forward. The cracks were always there. Everything the plane did made them move, and if you didn't think about that and focus on that, you couldn't make sense of anything that happened next. Efforts to combat poverty, effects of poverty on education purely from within schools, particularly by drilling down on traditional instructional models, which is what I think most charter schools are doing, is showing no evidence of success. There's been more than a decade. In order to show that success, if it could happen, I claim that that way of doing things is not going to work. In the case of focusing on teachers, I think the main problem that we face is that there just are not enough in the key subjects. Yes, we're all very engaged in different methods of instruction and trying to improve how that is done, but if the focus is on getting rid of bad teachers, I think we're going to be in very, very serious trouble. Reforming education by dismissing bad teachers and giving parents choice is no more likely to reform education than dismissing bad pilots was to prevent flawed airplanes from falling from the sky. So with that, I thank you. I'll be glad for suggestions on making this presentation work better, and I'll be also glad to answer any questions you might have.